Go ahead and share my screen and get started talking about the comedies through this slideshow. So if you are familiar with Much Ado About Nothing, you'll know that Benedict from there jokes a lot about why people have to get married. And part of that is the world must be peopled, right? We have to make babies, and therefore we have to fall in love and get married in Shakespeare's world. And that sort of theme, this is a quote that embodies a lot of the themes that are in Shakespeare's comedies. An overview of his comedies, he wrote 12 of them total, and most of them have this sort of marriage plot, like that quote I was just talking about, where it's like, you know, a couple or multiple couples are trying to get married, and the obstacle to overcome is often the father, okay? Comedies of the time, like other playwrights that were writing during Shakespeare's time, generally dealt with people of ordinary social status. So they were lighthearted, you know, making fun of people, having happy endings, that kind of thing, with your everyday common person, not like nobles and kings and stuff. Whereas tragedies, the more serious plays, dealt with the serious people, maybe, you know. Shakespeare included nobles in his comedies. So you might see a king or a nobleman or, you know, somebody of importance in the comedy itself, which was a little bit uncomfortable, I think, which made, if you've ever experienced like nervous laughter, I think there was a part of it that was like, oh, you're like making fun of somebody important, you know, or like something is funny about it. And so that was different that he did that. Instead of the tragedies where we tear people down a lot and there's a lot of strife and action against each other, comedies tend to focus on traits that human beings share. Okay, so they're not necessarily elevating one person over another. This person's good, this person's bad. Typically, they're about things that we share as humans, and they tend to focus on many protagonists. So even in The Taming of the Shrew, you'll see that there's two couples that were following through the story, not just one, like Othello, right? It's really about him and Desdemona and Iago. And in some other comedies too, there's multiple couples, maybe four couples that you're following through to see if, do they get together, what happens, right? That kind of thing. The audience in this way was encouraged to sort of compare the many fates and different ways that people could fall in love, just naturally from having multiple examples. Common themes in comedies was that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So you'll notice in Shakespeare's comedies, oftentimes when somebody falls in love, the other people around them might not see what's attractive about that person. So there's some comments about like, oh, that's great, like you're in love with him or her. Oh, they're not that good looking, but oh well, like they kind of make a comment like that. Okay. And the other theme is that love is overpowering, it's sudden and surprising. You can think of like Cupid shooting that bow and arrow and boom, you know, I'm in love. That's it. I had no thought process behind it. It just happened to me. Okay. So I do want to take a look closely at women in Shakespeare's comedies, primarily because we are reading The Taming of the Shrew. And The Taming of the Shrew is about two women primarily, and the idea of the perfect woman. Okay, so it's a little bit offensive, I'll say that, if you're, you know, as a warning to women or, you know, people who love women, right? It can be a little bit hard to swallow some of the ways in which women are depicted because of the history of the time. So women in Shakespeare's comedies were either two things. They were virgins or prostitutes. There really weren't a lot of other options out there. And the representation of women in his comedies were that they were high-spirited, frank, like forward about their desires, vocal and opinionated. And all of these were considered like negative traits at the time. They were associated with promiscuity and a woman that you wouldn't want to be around, which is why it was so funny, right? Like, oh my God, look at that woman behaving that way, right? Of course, it wasn't actually a woman on stage anyway, it was a man acting like a woman because women weren't allowed on stage. So there's a lot of layers to this here, right? About like, you know, what women can and cannot do. The comedies of the time that portrayed women this way were so funny and sort of rule breaking because there were these Renaissance conduct books going around, which gave instructions to women about how to act and behave. They were written by men, they were not written by women, as guides for fathers and husbands on how to control your woman, basically. And this was common practice, okay? So these Renaissance conduct books recommended that women be silent both at church and at home. And this idea actually comes from the Bible. So if you remember, King James came up with, his version of the Bible that's still around. This is a verse from 1 Corinthians 14. It says, as in all churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. And if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church. Okay, so I'm not trying to get religious here. I'm just saying this is where that idea stemmed from at the time for these Renaissance conduct books. All right, so what are these Renaissance conduct books? Let's dive in a little deeper here. You can see an example of one here. This is Viv's Instruction of a Christian Woman from 1557. These were instructional manuals, like I said, written on how women should behave. They were not written to women. They were written by fathers and husbands to fathers and husbands as an instruction manual for caring for an animal. They were written the same way you would writing a book about how to raise cattle or breed horses. Okay, so degrading to read. We'll read a few examples in a minute. Common topics, again, this is men writing about how to take care of a woman to another man. Common topics that they covered included breastfeeding, how women should be breastfeeding, learning of maidens, so learning of young women, love, how to choose a husband, if you're a father and you have a daughter, how do you choose a husband for her, how a woman should work to maintain a happy marriage so that her husband can tell her, things she can do to make sure he's happy. Okay. So let's take a look at Viv's views. So we're going to pull up a couple of quotes here. The first one says, Viv's knows that learned women are often suspected of maliciousness. So if you are a woman who is looking to learn something or trying to study or understand something, you shouldn't, because you could be malicious, you could be suspected of maliciousness. And so you should study wisdom, which means holding your tongue demurely in public and steering clear of teaching. So remain uneducated and hold your tongue in public. Okay, Vives calls love the dangerous kingdom of Venus. The miserable young woman who is entangled by love would be better to have broken a leg of her body, he says. Love causes global devastation, murder, slaughter, destruction of cities, of countries. Okay, so two things here I want to point out. One is the woman should not be in love. So what matters is the man falling in love. So you'll see some falling in love in Shakespeare's comedies, but that's not real. It's funny and uncomfortable, right? It makes people laugh because it's well, a woman doesn't really get to fall in love, right? And you'll also notice the spelling here is different. So you can see that standard has not quite solidified yet, right? During this time, we've talked about multiple times. So these are Viv's basically phonetic spellings of how those words, which is really fascinating. Okay, and last but not least, when it comes to choosing a husband, maidens should keep quiet and leave these decisions to their parents. It becometh not a maid to talk, where her father or mother be in communication about her marriage. So you should not talk when mom and dad are talking about your marriage and deciding who you should marry. Parents should take their duties seriously, preferring good and wise husbands over fair, rich, or noble. Fair meaning handsome or attractive. Okay, so for anybody who's not rich or attractive, but is good and wise, those are the guys to go for. All right, so this is basically the background of where Taming of the Shrew lands. Okay, so Shakespeare has all this context, these instructional books are going around, and he's writing The Taming of the Shrew. What is a shrew? A shrew is a woman who is ill-tempered, who talks a lot, and who is uncontrolled by her husband. Her husband is not able to control her. In that day and age, questioning your husband's authority was punishable by law. So it was actually illegal to question your husband or not obey him. Okay. So again, that's why it's so funny in a play if a woman does that, acts against her husband, because you could not do that. Okay. So during that time, they called women shrews, who were like not the most demure, perfect women, right? So punishment for shrewdness was taken really seriously. If you were accused of being a shrew, you could be subjected to public humiliation, where they might cart you through town. They had this thing called the skimmington or charivari, and they would cart you through town, and people would throw things at you and make fun of you, and they would like bang loud pots and pans and make a big stink about it. Or carting was the same thing. You'd be like on a stool or a chair and get carted through town, publicly humiliated. You can think of like, it's almost like when people get really mean on social media, but like in real life, like they were literally like throwing shit, at this person and just like going to town on the insults. And then oftentimes they ended in this thing called the ducking stool, which you can see over here, this lovely image of a woman on a chair, and she's going to be dunked into the river here with this contraption. A lot of times they would dunk women repeatedly. They were like tied to a chair and they would dunk them over and over. Or men, men had offenses that this would happen as well. But usually it resulted in death because the person couldn't breathe and they couldn't catch their breath from all the ducking. Okay. So people who went through this included shrews, unmarried mothers, like if you became pregnant and you were not married, this is what they would do. Husbands who didn't stand up to their wives. Okay. So like say you had a husband who was like nicer about things, right? And he doesn't have full control. He might get this charivari right through town. Or couples who didn't have children, because if you're not having children, what are you doing, right? There's no such thing as like, maybe you're infertile or maybe you're having other difficulties. It was just assumed that you weren't doing your due diligence, you weren't doing your duty as a married person. And so therefore, you deserve to be publicly humiliated and possibly die. Okay. So this is the world we're in. This is the taming of the shrew. Okay. So this play is about taming a shrew, a shrewish woman. Okay. So this was one of Shakespeare's first comedies. It was written in 1592 or earlier. We're not exactly sure on the year. Again, a shrew is a woman who's ill-tempered, talks a lot, uncontrolled by her husband. So we have one of those in the play. And the ideal woman is quiet, respectful, no problem being controlled by a man. Just like, yes, to everything you say, I completely agree. I'm totally quiet. I have no opinions, right? So the Taming of the Shrew contrasts these two types of women. There's an ideal woman and a shrew, and the shrew is somebody's trying to tame her, okay? Which sounds very like animalistic, and it is. I mean, the books at the time, the Renaissance books and things, they did talk about women like they were animals. So they're taming this woman, okay? It's an attempt to force the woman to submit to the control of her husband. Okay, doesn't sound so funny, does it? Like you talk about all this and you're like, I don't think this is a comedy anymore. And that's because times have changed, okay? But there is this question, we visited this before with like racism and sexism earlier in the semester, and it continues to come up with Shakespeare. And that is, was Shakespeare a proto-feminist? Was he showing how women should be able to behave by putting a shrew on stage? Like, is he sort of bringing us up in time, progressing us in society and saying like, hey, no, women should be able to behave this way. And here, let's, in play, in jest, in comedy, let's put a man disguised as a woman up on stage acting this way. Maybe he thought it wasn't that big of a deal. It's unlikely that he thought it wasn't a big deal at all, but he may have been playing with that idea a little bit more in a more acceptable way than others saw it. Or is this play a warning? Is it just showing how women can be tamed by marriage and would be tamed by marriage, and how to tame a woman in general, almost like instructions, but it's funny, right? And like, here's how you do it. So keep that in mind. It is a really interesting question. It's up for debate still. Scholars like talking about this stuff. Regardless, times did move forward. So seeing these kinds of things on stage progressed society gradually. Things got better, but I don't know if that was Shakespeare's intention or not, right? We won't know, but you can certainly make an argument one way or the other. I've mentioned previously, we didn't have time in our 4-week class to really dive into the inspiration for Shakespeare's plays, but I mentioned in passing that a lot of his plays were inspired by either a story that he adapted into a play, or something that happened to him, or whatever. But he's not always the originator of everything in the play. In fact, he's not. So this case is no different. The Taming of the Shrew inspiration was this story called A Merry Jest of a Shrewd and Cursed Wife, Lapped in Moral Skin for Her Good Behavior. Okay, this was written in 1550, so about 7 years earlier-ish. So anyway, I'm going to read this to you and we'll talk a little bit about what Shakespeare did here. So in this story, a father has 2 daughters, one cursed, the other docile. Cursed meaning like a shrew, okay? When a wooer seeks the shrewish daughter's hand, so a guy comes to ask for her hand in marriage, the father warns him against this devilish fiend of hell, he calls his daughter, okay? So like, you don't want to marry her. Unmoved, the suitor marries her and proceeds to tame her by means of beatings and torture, okay? So like literal physical abuse. After cudgeling her bloody, like beating her until she's all bloody, he wraps her in a salted moral skin, and the ballad ends conventionally with a meal at which the father, mother, and neighbors admire the once shrewish wife's obedience, and they give a challenge to the audience that he that can charm a shrewd wife better than thus, let him come to me and fetch 10 pounds and a golden purse. Okay, so basically this ballad, this short story is about how to tame a wife, and if a man is able to do that, then he's worth so much, you know, and he tames her by cudgeling her bloody, right? That does not happen in Shakespeare's play, so we're not reading about physical abuse, but we're certainly reading about some emotional and other means of torture or manipulation here to tame the shrew in the play. Okay, so that is the overview of Taming of the Shrew. I hope you find some funny moments in it. It is more lighthearted, certainly, than the tragedies that we've been reading, but it is definitely not like the laugh out loud thing that you might think of when you think of a comedy. I look forward to reading your thoughts. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I'll see you online.